So I don't know about you, but sometimes really old random phrases or song lyrics from my childhood will just kind of suddenly pop up out of nowhere in my mind. And because I continue to be fascinated by how our minds work and how it remembers things, it was really interesting for me this month to recognize that one particular phrase has appeared to me at least once a year, probably since elementary school, or maybe even earlier. So for almost 60 years now. And what seems to prompt it is when I do one particular thing, which is to flip open the calendar to March. Apparently, every year, this lets an old nursery rhyme know that it is time to float up out of the dark ocean of my childhood memories and rise to the surface. And I'm sure these words are something we probably all know, which are March winds and April showers bring forth May flowers. March winds and April showers bring forth May flowers. And of course, as a child, I'm sure this helped me to remember what the weather was going to bring us in the spring. But today, as a Buddhist teacher, I honestly find so much meaning in that really simple phrase. The first thing that comes to my mind is that it really directly points to one of the main teachings of our practice, which is the truth that everything in this life is constantly changing and impermanent. All the seasons, all beings, creatures, things, situations, emotions, the universe itself, and of course, ourselves. We are all in constant, never ending motion and transition. It also reminds me that thankfully, life is not just going to bring us a constant barrage of wind and rain and snow. Yay. It's also going to bring us sun and flowers, which again are also impermanent, and on and on and on it goes. So that phrase or rhyme also points to what I really want to explore today, which is something the Buddha called the eight worldly winds, though you may also have heard them described as the eight vicissitudes or concerns, the eight dharmas or conditions or attachments, and I'm sure there's many more of these. But because it's the windy season, and because right now, as I'm recording this, it's blowing like crazy outside, for this talk, I think I'm just going to stick with the eight worldly winds. And with that in mind, I want to start by reading this short description of the winds directly from the Lokavapatti Sutta, where the Buddha tells us this. He says, monks, which means us, these eight worldly conditions spin after the world, and the world spins after these eight worldly conditions. Which eight? Gain and loss, status and disgrace, praise and blame, and pleasure and pain. These are the eight worldly conditions that spin after the world, and the world spins after these eight worldly conditions. And I'll read those again. Gain and loss, status and disgrace, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. And so you might have noticed that basically these are four pairs of opposite conditions. And if we can think of them as kind of umbrella categories, it can help us to remember that they are mainly referring to all the conditions in our lives that we hope for and all of those that we fear. So, for instance, we all tend to seek out and maybe hope for gain, status, praise, and pleasure. And then we all, of course, tend to fear or not want loss, disgrace, blame, or pain. And of course, this just seems like a really obvious truth. But the idea here is that if through our practice we can start paying closer attention to these, we'll start to notice that not only are all of these conditions constantly arising and passing and changing, just like everything, but that we ourselves are constantly either wanting or not wanting these particular things at both conscious and unconscious levels. And depending on how we're relating to them, our fears and our hopes about these 8 worldly winds, this can often dictate how we experience our entire world. Before I go on, I just want to pause for a second and remind us that it's not that wanting or fearing any of these things in and of themselves is going to cause us to create suffering and stress. Of course, we want things like gain and status, praise and pleasure. And of course, we don't want loss, disgrace, pain, and blame. It's really okay. We're all human. It's just the way we're wired to want or not want those things. We also want to remember and keep in mind that we really don't have a lot of control over these different conditions. Again, they are constantly arriving and departing throughout our entire lives, just like the wind. So, for example, sometimes they can arrive as a slight breeze that doesn't last that long. Or sometimes, of course, they can arrive in the form of a really intense storm that might completely shake up our whole world. Or maybe it lasts just much longer than we expected it to. So an example of this might be experiencing a slight breeze of some minor insult, right? Doesn't last that long. Or we might experience a more serious storm, like maybe a difficult health diagnosis. And again, with both of these, we really just don't have a lot of control over what arises in our lives. And again, these conditions or winds really aren't the problem, because if that were the case, life itself would be a problem, right? What we're being asked to recognize is that our level of either attachment or resistance to our wanting or not wanting any of these conditions is essentially what's going to determine our level of stress and suffering, or our sense of balance and ease. Okay? So this is really the key, the most important thing to remember, that our level of attachment or resistance is what is going to determine our level of stress or ease. For instance, if we take a closer look, we might notice that whenever we find ourselves swept up into wanting or not wanting, it can often feel like we're trapped in some sort of stress tornado, right? Like we're basically just being spun around and around by these winds. And what we tend to want, sometimes desperately, right, is to just make it stop. We want the pain of the wanting or the not wanting to somehow be fixed. And what this means is having things turn out exactly the way we want them to, because somehow we think that that is what's going to fix it. Right? Of course, the problem is that this is really, truly impossible, to make everyone and everything in our lives be exactly as we want them to be all the time. And as we all know, we each have all manner and variety of strategies to try to avoid the pain and frustration of all this wanting and not wanting, all of which, of course, just tends to make things even worse. One of my professors at Europa University, the great teacher Judy Leaf, once wrote what I thought was a really good explanation of this. She wrote, "It is one thing to recognize what we would like to attract and what we prefer to get rid of, and quite another to be obsessed with getting our way and terrified of things going wrong. These cycles of hope and fear," she said, "occupy our minds and capture our energy. No matter what is happening to us, we think it could be better or at least different. No matter who we are, we think we could be better or at least different. nothing is ever good enough, and so we can never relax. Right? And so here she's really describing what the Buddha called dukkha, or suffering, which has often been translated as the suffering that we experience when we cannot seem to find permanent satisfaction. If we think about this, we often tend to have this notion, mostly unconsciously, but sometimes even consciously, that if we could just set up our lives to only experience those pleasant wins, then we could really achieve permanent satisfaction. Right? So it's like sometimes we have a kind of hopeful underlying belief that someday, finally, we're going to discover that sweet spot and life is just going to stay that way permanently. Permanent satisfaction. But as those of us who've lived on this planet long enough can attest, life just has a way of continuing to pull that rug out from under us and disrupting that wish over and over and over again. And this is actually exactly what the Buddha was trying to draw our attention to 2,600 years ago now, right after his enlightenment, when he offered us his first sermon on the Four Noble Truths. In that very first noble truth, the Buddha simply acknowledged there is suffering, or there is dukkha, dissatisfaction, as well as the truth that we all experience this, right? So none of us are immune to this. So if this is really it, if this is life itself, the full catastrophe, as the teacher John Kabat-Zinn has called it, what do we do, right? How do we work with this? How do we remain steady and find some peace and ease in the very center of the storm? So to begin, our practice is really inviting us to actively become much more conscious about our particular fears and hopes so that we can learn how not to cling too tightly to what we want and to not so strongly reject or push away what we don't want. And so we really want to become more aware of and explore our particular hopes and fears so that we'll be able to really catch ourselves more quickly whenever we find that we've been swept up again into a kind of stressful tornado of wanting or not wanting. One of the ways that we can start to take a closer look at these is through the eyes of the ancient Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who termed these 8 conditions as the 8 worldly preoccupations, as in, these are the fears and hopes that we all tend to preoccupy ourselves with. You might even just take a moment right now just to consider this for a minute for yourself. Are you in any way right now preoccupied with wanting something in your life? Maybe some gain, status, pleasure, praise. Just take a moment to think about this. You might also consider if you're maybe preoccupied with not wanting something, right? So maybe not wanting some loss or afraid of some disgrace or pain or blame. So just take a moment to think about that. One of the great things about our mindfulness practice is that it really can help us to more clearly see and acknowledge what our mind tends to be focused on or, again, preoccupied with, so that we can hold it up into the light of our awareness and really examine it a bit and see if we can in some way start to let go or maybe let be and create a little more space around it. Can also be really helpful for us to better understand why our clinging and resistance are causing us so much extra stress. And so I thought we might dive into this a little bit by taking a closer look at each of these four pairs of winds or conditions. So to begin, we might consider, why does hoping for something or fearing the loss of something tend to cause us so much stress? And as a reminder, it is not that we don't hope or want, or that we don't have fear of losing things. Again, of course we do. It's just part of being human. But as the Buddha so wisely points out, the problem lies in our level of attachment to these things, or maybe we can think of it as the amount of hope that we invest in things turning out a particular way. So, for instance, we tend to put so much weight into things being exactly as we want them to be that we end up, in a way, carrying that sort of mental weight around with us, almost like we're literally carrying heavy chains around, because we're so unwilling to let go of our expectations of how things should be. And with this worldly wind, hope of gain and fear of loss, one particular word that we can very consciously invite ourselves to become much more aware of is the word should, as in I should, or he, she, they should, or it should be somehow different than it is. Okay? The word should is actually almost always toxic. So when we can start to notice our level of attachment to our shoulds, it can really shed some light on how much stress it's causing us, which can really help us to start letting go of our tight grip a little more. As a helpful reminder of this, I often tell students not to should all over themselves. I hope that's helpful to remember. Please don't should all over yourself. There's also a wonderful old parable from the Zen tradition that I like to remember when working with this one. And I think many of you have likely already heard it. It involves a farmer and his son who had a beloved stallion who helped the family earn a living. One day the horse ran away, and their neighbors exclaimed, "Your horse ran away, what terrible luck." And the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not, we'll see." A few days later, the horse returned home, leading a few wild mares back to the farm. And the neighbors shouted, "Your horse returned and brought several horses home with him. What great luck." The farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." Later that week, the farmer's son was trying to break one of the mares, and she threw him to the ground and broke his leg. And the villagers cried, "Your son broke his leg. What terrible luck." And the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see." So obviously, the story can go on and on and on, and it does. But I hope you get the point. I actually love that Zen phrase so much. I've had it written on a sticky note for years now, because it really does help remind me to loosen my grip and become more willing to live with uncertainty rather than holding on so tightly. So we can try to remember, maybe so, maybe not, we'll see. Another of those pair of worldly winds that we can explore is our desire for status or even fame, as well as our fear of disgrace or maybe insignificance. And with this one, I find it really helpful to remember that our hope and our fear around these two things is actually built into our DNA. So we all want to feel some sort of belonging to a particular community or a tribe. And we all fear disgrace of somehow being ostracized from the collective. In ancient times, we all survived in smaller tribes. So being excluded from this usually meant the unlikely prospect of trying to survive on our own in really harsh conditions. And so we're actually wired to have these hopes and fears. It's really okay. It's so good to remember. But again, if we want to reduce our suffering around this, we want to use our practice to take a good look at our current day attachment to these ancient hopes and fears. So, for instance, instead of having a fear about survival, today what we might find ourselves trying to protect is our image of ourselves, or maybe our story about ourselves, or about how things reflect on our identity or our ego. This December, I went up to Massachusetts on a longer retreat, and I spent some of my time in the library. And in a book that I was reading by the teacher Mark Epstein, I was so happy to come across a story that I hadn't heard before about one of my old writing teachers, the great beat poet Allen Ginsberg. Apparently, when Allen was in India studying with the Indian teacher Devraha Baba, who many considered a saint, he was bemoaning to Baba about how he and a close friend had recently grown apart and how lonely he was feeling because of this. In the book, the interaction was described this way, quote, "On his tiny platform suspended over the rushing waters of the Ganges, Baba looked at Allen. He tilted his head from side to side and sucked his teeth. 'Oh,' he exclaimed, and with a tenderness that struck deep at Allen's heart, he said softly, 'How wounded, how wounded.'" And Epstein wrote about this. "In his gentle, caring, but unsparing and unsentimental way, the Baba's retort helped bring Ginsberg's self-identification as a wounded soul into awareness." And this is so important. What Baba was gently pointing out was that while the loneliness was definitely causing Alan some pain, his identity of himself as someone who was, quote, wounded, was what was causing him the most suffering. As the Buddha so wisely told us, whatever is taken to be a self will cause suffering. Whatever is taken to be a self will cause suffering. So essentially, what Baba's response did was to knock Alan out of his delusion. And suddenly he could see how much extra suffering he was creating for himself by defining himself in this way. What he realized was that this was just a really old habit of mind, arising from a kind of entrenched, established identity that was formed in childhood, and it was causing him to suffer even more. And just as a confession, as I was reading that story in the library, I was feeling a bit of the same. And so this really struck me at the right moment. I was so grateful. It also occurred to me that the opposite of this phrase might be so special, which is another phrase that I've heard. And it's when we think that we are somehow so much more important than other people, that in some way we're special, which is also simply another kind of identity, isn't it? And again, it's one that can cause us so much pain when we're believing it, or maybe even when we're trying to nurture it and maintain it. And so now, whenever I notice myself being blown around, if you will, by this particular wind, I have yet another phrase written on a sticky note to ponder, which is so special, so wounded. So special, so wounded. That phrase also very closely relates to another one of those pairs, which are two that we are almost constantly being bombarded with, which are the winds of praise and blame. And so, as with all the others, we might notice that with these winds, we often feel like we want a kind of perfection here too, don't we? And also a kind of permanence, which mainly involves only wanting positive opinions of ourselves from others, which unfortunately, again, sadly, is just completely impossible. And personally, whenever I'm struggling with this particular wind, I like to remind myself of a famous passage from the Buddha, who was actually criticized quite a lot when he was alive. In it, he tells us this: "This has been going on through the ages. They criticize the silent ones. They criticize the talkative ones. They criticize the moderate ones. There is no one in the world that escapes criticism. There never was and never will be, nor is there now, the wholly criticized or the wholly approved. And I just love that passage because it can help us to remember that, again, we're not special and we're not being singled out, right? We're not the only ones being wounded by criticism, even though when it's happening, of course, it can really often feel like that. Just last week, I was given a great example of this when my husband and I were watching an old episode of The Office. And the character Pam, who you likely know as the office secretary, was telling the interviewer, quote, "I hate the idea that someone out there hates me. I even hate thinking that Al Qaeda hates me. I think that if they got to know me, they wouldn't hate me." It just sounds really funny. So when we're investigating this one, another thing to notice is whether our dukkha or dissatisfaction might be showing up in the form of feeling like we can just never get enough praise to fully satisfy us. Just something to ponder. On the flip side, we can also notice if we're somehow feeling like we can never be fully free from the threat of being found wanting in some way. Never free of that threat of being found wanting. With this particular wind, we might also notice that when we're really attached to both our hope and our fear about how we're being perceived, it can often feel like we're being pushed and pulled back and forth by other people's different opinions of us. Right? We might even notice, again, how maybe preoccupied we can become with this. The Tibetan Buddhist master Lama Yeshe calls this the constant yo-yo effect, which he describes this way. Someone gave me a present. I feel so happy. Someone took away my gift. I'm so unhappy. Somebody says, "You're wonderful," and I feel up. Somebody says, "You made a mistake," and then my mood goes down. And I'm sure we can all relate to that. I actually remember experiencing a very clear example of this when I was reading some of the comments about a talk that I'd recently posted. And in the first comment, this person wrote that she really appreciated hearing my laughter throughout the talk and that she'd been laughing right along with me. And in the very next comment box, someone else had written that while they had really enjoyed my talk, they found my laughter just completely distracting. And so in the span of about 30 seconds, maybe less, I got to experience those two opposites, praise and blame, right in the same moment. And so it caught me because I was experiencing both at the same time, and I didn't know which one was true, if you will. And my ego suddenly had nothing to do and nowhere to go. And in that moment, I noticed that there was really no identity that I could hook myself to. And so I found myself just laughing out loud about this. And I also recognized that if I'd only gotten one of those comments, I probably would have had a much different experience. And what it reminded me was that really neither comment was really about me at all. And recognizing this, I could truly let go of needing again to feel either special or wounded. It was really very liberating. Which brings me to the fourth pair of winds, which are often called the winds of pleasure and pain. And these two are probably the most difficult ones for all of us because basically they encompass all the others. The Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna again termed this pair of winds happiness versus suffering. And he explained that we tend to look at things in terms of our hope for happiness and our fear of suffering. And whenever I'm teaching newcomers about the practice, I often like to describe how in the teachings, our emotional lives are often likened to the ocean. which, as you might imagine, experiences all these different winds, all of which can create a variety of different waves in the water. And so if we can imagine that we ourselves are that ocean, the truth is that it's our common tendency to only want to experience the waves or the winds of gain, pleasure, success, and praise, right? We tend to really welcome those or maybe even seek them out. And of course, we also tend to want to resist those inevitable waves that come that might be filled with pain or grief, anger, maybe a sense of failure or blame. We really don't want to experience those waves. But again, the problem is that whenever we resist or try to black out all those difficult waves that arrive, what happens is that we ourselves tend to become more like ice cubes than flowing water. And sadly, in our effort to kind of protect ourselves by trying to block it out or resist, what happens is that we only end up hardening our own hearts. And instead of protecting us, what happens is that we not only lock in whatever that wave brought, the grief or the anger, the blame, etc., we also end up blocking out our full capacity for joy, our full capacity for experiencing life itself. So essentially, what the teachings around all of these different winds are asking of us is to practice, which means not perfectly, practice riding all of those waves or winds of our lives fully, allowing each of them to be experienced as they arrive, and to let ourselves fully feel them, right? To feel the joy and the gladness, as well as the grief or the anger or whatever it is, without automatically maybe acting out on these emotions or clinging to them or resisting them. Instead, what we're being asked to do is to fully investigate these winds when they arrive, okay? To open up to them and see what they might have to teach us, and to allow them to kind of soften us so that we can truly start to experience more flow and ease in our lives. Many years ago, there was a famous phrase attributed to Jon Kabat-Zinn that was turned into posters that I used to see at some of the retreat centers. It's a really common phrase, so you may have heard it, but it relates to this teaching, which is, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. Another one of my teachers, Jonathan Faust, offers a kind of shorter version of that phrase, which is simply surfs up, surfs up. And I have to admit, I love that one. First, because it's much simpler to remember, and also because it's really light, right? Surfs up, which might help us add a little humor into the mix when the winds are not so strong and heavy. We might even use another one of those sticky note phrases as a reminder to us that, this is it, right? One of those winds is simply arising, surfs up. And instead of resisting or holding on, we can instead practice becoming open to fully knowing what it is that's flowing through. And honestly, this opening up to the knowing is really our whole practice, right? It's learning how we can courageously soften and open more and more instead of clinging and resisting. And in doing so, we can discover so much more peace. My favorite Buddhist nun, Pema Chodron, says it this way: we want to know our pain so that we can stop endlessly running. We want to know our pleasure so we can stop endlessly grasping. Then somehow our questions get bigger and our inquisitiveness more vast. We want to know about loss so we might understand other people when their lives are falling apart. We want to know about gain so we might understand other people when they are delighted or when they get arrogant and puffed up and carried away. When we become more insightful and compassionate about how we ourselves get hooked, we spontaneously feel more tenderness for the human race. So, when we're working with these 8 winds, what we're really practicing essentially is the quality of equanimity, which has often been called the fruit of our whole practice. In the Pali language, there are several words for equanimity, but the most common of these is upekkha, and its root meaning is to look over. So it refers to the equanimity that arises from the power of observation, the ability to see without being caught by what we see. Equanimity is also a word that's often used for this ability to, quote, weather the storm of our lives with what is called balanced awareness, right? A sense of steadiness and ease in the midst of all these fluid, changing, impermanent conditions. So, for this reason, equanimity has also been translated as Tatra Mahatata, which ultimately means to stand in the middle of all of this. Right? To stand in the middle of all of this. So, sometimes as encouragement, it helps me to recall this image from the teachings where the Buddha tells us, quote, praise and blame, recognition and disregard, gain and loss, pleasure and sorrow come and go like the wind. Rest like a giant tree in the midst of them all. Rest like a giant tree in the midst of them all. Remembering, of course, that a healthy tree flows and bends and sings with the wind, allows the wind to wash through. And finally, before I want to offer you a short meditation on these 8 worldly winds, I feel in a way almost always required to mention my very favorite phrase about equanimity, which comes from one of my favorite teachers, Yoyo, who very famously summed up our entire practice in 4 words, the whole practice, which is keep calmly knowing change. Keep calmly knowing change. So we keep, which means continually, calmly, without reacting, knowing, being aware of the truth of change. In a very similar way, in the Lokavapatti Sutta, where the Buddha first introduces us to the teachings of the 8 worldly winds, he tells us this. Gain, loss, status, disgrace, censure, praise, pleasure, pain. These conditions among humans are inconstant, impermanent, and subject to change. Knowing this, the wise person, mindful, ponders these changing conditions. Desirable things don't charm the mind. Undesirable ones bring no resistance. Ones welcoming and rebelling are scattered, gone to their end, do not exist. So that's some encouragement maybe for us. And I'd like to invite you now into a meditation on the 8 worldly winds, if this is available for you. And so if you're listening somewhere at home, maybe where you can sit, I'd like to invite you to come into a comfortable posture, maybe closing the eyes, taking a few nice deep breaths in, slow breaths out. Full rounds of these on your own, just to come into the body, become embodied. If you're out walking or driving as you're listening to this, you might place some attention on your breath, and then maybe notice the bottom of your feet as you're walking, or your seat on the cushion if you're driving, your hands on the steering wheel. In some way, notice your body become more embodied, more present, maybe listening to sound. Some of you may be able to hear the wind or the cows here that I'm hearing here on the farm. As you continue to notice the breath in the body, using that as your anchor, bring you home to the body. You might also relax different parts of the body, really let go. So again, if you're sitting, you might notice the earth holding you, and the weight of your body being held by the earth. See if you can let go a little more with the support of the earth. You might notice your shoulders. See if you can drop the shoulders a bit, let go here. You might notice the center of the palms. You can soften the center of the palms, open the hands a little more in a gesture of receiving, letting go. And you might notice the face. See if you can soften here, the skin, letting the forehead be smooth, eyes soft in their sockets, teeth slightly parted so the jaw can relax. Still aware of breathing. And each exhale, letting the body soften a little more, letting the mind become more clear. And as you're ready, I'd like to invite you to consider what you might be particularly maybe preoccupied with lately. What is your mind preoccupied with lately? And with as much kindness and compassion as you can muster, without any judgment, just for clarity, you might consider, am I preoccupied with hoping for something, or am I fearing something? Take a moment to consider if you're caught up in hoping or fearing. As you're ready, I'd like to invite you to consider, am I preoccupied with gaining some sort of status? Or am I maybe afraid of losing it in some way? No right or wrong answer, just consider. As you're ready now, I'd like to invite you to consider, am I preoccupied lately with some particular praise or blame? Wanting praise, fearing blame, etc. Again, no right or wrong answers. Just consider. As you're ready now, I'd like to invite you to consider, am I preoccupied with seeking out some sort of pleasure or maybe avoiding some sort of pain? Again, no right or wrong answers, just consider with as much kindness and compassion as you can. As you're ready now, I'd like to invite you to just pick one of those things that I mentioned, maybe one that feels the strongest to you, or something you're the most preoccupied with. And I want to invite you to notice how you've been holding it. So you might even consider, how has this been living in the body, this hope or this fear? How have I been holding it? As you're ready now, you might consider using those Zen phrases from the story of the farmer and see what happens when you ask yourself something like, maybe so, maybe not, we'll see. Maybe so, maybe not, we'll see. Just see how that lands. You might even consider two other phrases from the Zen tradition, which are not always so, not always so, and my favorite, which is, what if nothing's wrong? What if nothing's wrong? And so just try on whatever seems to resonate and consider if you might view whatever you've been struggling with a little differently. You might even consider, what might help me discover some more space around this?